Hello and welcome back to our next section for the class, this one about theatrical genres. In this section, we're going to be talking about a bunch of different movements and styles of theater throughout history, mainly because you'll have noticed through most of our class, we talk mainly about ancient Greece and then we skip forward to modern drama, which begins around the mid 1800s. And so there's a big time jump there. And so, in order to give you some information about the type of theater that happens in between that long period of time, we're going to spend this section going over some of those movements. Now, just like I said at the beginning of the semester, we're really only going to be talking about Western theater in this section. And again, there's many movements of theater in the East, in Asia and South Asia. Um, so we're not going to be covering those in this sense. That is a very large subject matter that you could do an entire class on. So for this one, we're going to be talking about the different movements of Western theater in between the two main sections we've talked about already this semester. But of course, before we do that, we do have to talk about ancient Greece a little bit. We're not going to go fully into ancient Greece since we talk a lot about it, but it is a good starting off point. So, like we've talked about before, ancient Greek theater was performed in honor of the god Dionysus. Playwrights wrote a trilogy of dramas and one satyr play. Now, in the bottom right corner there, you see kind of an artist's rendition of what an amphitheater in Greece would have looked like at the time. And now I'll show you right here an image of what the amphitheaters actually look like, what they actually were. As you can see, they're very large. Ancient Greek theater, they didn't have much of an emphasis on sets and costumes. And that's something that we're going to see throughout a lot of these movements that we go through. A lot of them don't have an emphasis on sets and costumes, but there was still some emphasis on production craft, production quality. So you can see it was a very large space. You can see kind of the context for how big the space is with the people that are already there. And so the theater would be built on a hillside like this, and the seats would be built on the incline of the hill. And at the bottom of the hill would be the performance space that you see there, the circular area right in the middle. And then the area behind there would have been some buildings or some type of structure there where the actors, kind of a backstage area in a way, but it was also used to house any type of special effects that they did. There were some special effects that were utilized in ancient Greece. The most notable is one you might have heard before in English classes, something called a Deus ex machina. It's become a kind of literary term, which is why you might have heard it in your English classes. And so the literary term refers to any time in a story that the character has, I guess, insurmountable odds. There's a lot that they're facing, and the writer or the storyteller finds some easy way to solve the problem. An example of this would be if somebody, needs a certain amount of money or their whole life is going to, fall apart. They're going to lose their house, their family will be homeless, they can't feed their children. And then you watch them trying to overcome this throughout the story, and then at the end of the story they win the lottery and everything's better. And so it's a deus ex machina because you think, well, why did I have to watch him go through all those hurdles and face all those obstacles when in the end you're just going to win the lottery? It's kind of an easy solution. And that comes from the style of theater or style of special effect in ancient Greece called the deus ex machina, which literally translates to the God machine. And the reason why it was called this was that one aspect of a lot of Greek plays that you'll find is the main character will be facing these insurmountable odds. A character will be facing one person against an army of 100 or something like that. And then at the end, a god comes down and basically solves the problem of the play for the main character. They're facing 100 soldiers by themselves, and the god comes down and obliterates the army and says, "There you go, story done." And so it's kind of an easy solution. And in ancient Greece, what they would do is they would actually have an actor playing the god be hooked up to this pulley system. And so then they would lift the actor up in the air so that they were hovering over the other actors on stage to give them the godlike appearance. And so this pulley machine was called the Deus Ex Machina, or the God Machine. And so it eventually became the literary term that it is today. But it gives you a sense of what the production craft for ancient Greek shows were. So there weren't really any costumes, there weren't any sets, they weren't making that circular area there look like the location that they were in, and the actors weren't dressing in any special way. They would have just been wearing their regular clothes at the time. But there was some emphasis on production craft, on special effects. So that's ancient Greek theater. And the reason why we go through that is because our first real uh, movement of theater that we're going to be talking about comes directly after it, and it's called Roman theater. So we're going to look at theater during ancient Rome. So the Roman theater was very similar to Greek theater. However, there was a clear separation of classes. The rich class would have probably seen some adaptation or reenactment of ancient Greek plays, and they would be, in a nice theater building or amphitheater. And the poor class would have seen a traveling troupe performing a satyr play or some type of comedic play. And so, what we mean by troupe, it's a term that's come up a couple times in the semester. But just to recap, a troupe is just kind of a group of actors who all work together on different projects or different shows, and they kind of travel around. They'll go to one's town, set up shop on a street corner, perform until they feel they've earned all they can, pack it up, and then move to the next town. So that would be an example of a troupe. And so that was the type of theater that the poor classes were mainly seeing, because they would be right on the street corner where they lived there. So some of the notable playwrights of this time, the first one we have is a playwright called Seneca. And just like a lot of the Roman playwrights of the time, you'll see Seneca is credited for writing Oedipus and Medea. However, this isn't the Oedipus and Medea that we mainly know, and that's because Roman playwrights mainly rewrote or adapted the ancient Greek plays into the Roman tradition. So you'll find two versions of the play Oedipus and Medea. You'll find the Greek version of Oedipus and the Roman version of Oedipus, Greek version of Medea and the Roman version of Medea. And so the playwrights of Rome, like Seneca, would rewrite these plays, and then they would be performed for the people of Rome. Much like a lot of Roman culture or ancient Roman culture, you'll find they took from the Greek culture heavily. Now, there's two other very important playwrights that we get out of this time, and this is the one thing that kind of separates Roman theater from Greek theater, and that is the two playwrights Terence and Plautus. And they basically took the idea of the satyr play and took it further. So they were very popular among the poor classes of Rome. They would write these satirical plays that kind of lampoon the rich aristocracy, and the poorer classes loved it. To give a kind of context to the type of shows they wrote, if you're familiar with the show South Park, there's two recurring characters on there called Terrence and Phillip, who are very much hated by the adults of the town, and all the children love them. And the reason why the adults hate them is because their comedy is a bunch of poop and fart jokes, and the adults think that's too lowbrow, and the children love it. And I've always wondered if the names of those two characters were taken from these ancient Greek writers, Terence and Plautus, because this is basically what not only the type of shows Terence and Plautus wrote, but this is also an example of how they were received. Terence and Plautus wrote these satyr plays, which are basically a lot of, sexually charged shows with a lot of poop and fart jokes in it. Um, the poor classes loved it, and the rich classes hated it. They thought it was too lowbrow, and they thought it was not worthwhile. But the poor classes, they enjoyed it. They thought it was funny, and Terence and Plautus were basically making fun of the rich aristocracy. So of course, the rich class hated it, and the poor class loved it. And the reason why this is also really important is because it brings us to a term used today uh, for for different types of art that the term didn't exist at this time, but this is definitely the first or very first example of it. That's a term called escapism. You might hear this term every now and then. Escapism is basically a type of theater, but it's not just applied to theater. It can be film and TV and art in general, but a type of theater that's meant to allow the audience to escape their own troubles and fall into the world of the story. And depending on who you're speaking to, this can be used as praise or as criticism. You'll hear this word used a lot when it comes to action movies. Whenever the big budget action movie of the summer comes out, there'll be some reviewer that says, "Oh, well, that was just pure escapism." And what they're saying is this big, flashy action movie has no intellectual value. You're not going to think, it's not going to challenge you. You're basically just going to turn your brain off for 2 hours and watch, the flashy explosions and special effects on stage. And that's escapism. So that's kind of the way it's used for criticism. But escapism is also used as praise because people will say no, there is a value for escapist work. And you could see this as an example with Terence and Plautus. The poor class of ancient Rome, it was a very difficult, grueling life. You worked very long hours with doing physical labor, and you barely had enough to get by. And so, after working your whole day at some physically demanding, physically grueling job, the last thing you want to see at the end of the day is to watch a show about how difficult it is to be in the poor ruling class. You don't want to be reminded of how difficult life is. You just want to be able to tune out your own troubles and escape into the world of a story and be happy and enjoy what you're watching. And so that is how escapism can be used as praise. Why do I want to be reminded of how difficult life is when I'm living that every day? I watch art, or I consume art to be happy. So help me escape. And that's what escapism would be. And that's why Terence and Plautus were so popular among the poor classes. Their characters championed the poor classes of Rome and criticized and made fun of the rich aristocracy. And so you can see a picture of them there. And what's funny enough is, uh, despite how much the rich classes of Rome hated them, they're one of the few surviving playwrights of the time that we have. Majority of their plays haven't survived. They say that Terence probably wrote over 130 plays and only about 25 of them survived. But if you told somebody in the time during in ancient Rome that one of the two of the three playwrights that'll mainly be remembered from your time are Terence and Plautus, they probably would have passed out right on the spot. So they were a very interesting figure at the time, and they were kind of escapism before escapism was even a term. The last thing that will be mentioned is something you can't really escape when talking about Roman theater, and that is the Roman gladiator battles. As some of you will be familiar with this. It's been used. It's a thing that's been used in movies quite a lot. The Roman tradition was for entertainment, they would have people fight to the death in the Colosseum or similar buildings like it, and people would watch this as a form of entertainment. And it was very violent, it was very bloody, and it was also morally wrong because they would take people that they enslaved and force them to go fight. Now, the reason why they did this was because, interestingly enough, the way it was used or the way it was billed to people as entertainment was that it was they were using it as a way to reenact uh, and commemorate Roman military victories. So what they would do is they would take some Roman soldiers and cast them in this kind of production and cast them as actual Roman soldiers. And then they would take the poor, malnourished people they enslaved and cast them as whoever the losing side of the battle was and force them to fight these soldiers. And so you take, a bunch of people who have been enslaved and not fed, have no combat training and put them up against a very healthy, trained Roman soldier, then, well, you know exactly how that's going to turn out. But this was what was used as theater in Roman times, unfortunately. And so you can't talk about theater in Rome without unfortunately talking about this. But they went to great lengths to create these productions. What you see here is some pictures today of what the Roman Colosseum looks like. And so on the bottom left there, you get kind of a fishbowl look of it. And what you see there, the structures in the middle section are what was underground. At the time, that was covered, and that was the floor of the Colosseum. And those structures beneath were the cells where they would hold the slaves before they forced them to go up there and fight. But they would actually try to create sets and things sometimes in this space. In fact, they would even sometimes flood the entire uh, pit of the Colosseum there and reenact naval battles. So they would flood it and then put actual ships in there, and people would reenact the naval battles that the Roman Empire won. So, an interesting aspect of Roman theater, not just with these gladiator battles, but with theater in general, was they did have more of an emphasis on the spectacle, on on costumes and sets, and maybe not necessarily like we think of them today, but they were definitely a culture that was more inclined toward the flashy visual spectacle of what they were doing. So eventually the Roman Empire falls and theater kind of dwindles down to just some traveling troops for a while. And it's not until we get to the 5th century that we get our next movement of theater, mystery or miracle plays. Um, and so, like I said, this was from the 5th to the 10th century, and they're very simply plays performed by the church. So at the time, well, not just at this time, and most times in history, the church is usually not very favorable of theater for many different reasons. But they usually find it, you know, I guess a good word for it would be immoral. The themes are usually things that they're not very fond of, like young lovers having sex before they're married and things like that. So the churches have never been very fond of the theater, but there was one period of time where the church actually embraced theater and used it, and that was during this period. So the church realized that they had a problem. They came up against a problem, and that is if you're going to learn about Christianity, what is the reference point that you have? The reference point is the Bible. If you want to learn about Christianity, then read the Bible. But they realized at the time that majority of people were illiterate. And so their whole religion is outlined in a book and nobody can read it. So what they decided to do was to perform the Bible for people. so that since they can't read it, they can see it. So these were plays performed by the church, and they were basically reenactments of stories from the Bible. Um, now, I use two terms there, mystery slash miracle play, because sometimes when you look these up, people will make a distinction between the two. They'll say a miracle play is any reenactment of a saint performing a miracle, and a mystery play is a reenactment of any other story from the Bible. But most theater historians, and for the sake of, will use the two terms interchangeably, and for the sake of this class, we'll use them interchangeably. So mystery slash miracle plays are basically any reenactment of a story from the Bible. So like I said, they were performed at the church, and they were also performed by the church. The clergy themselves would perform it. The priest, would perform it along with the other people at the church. But there was not an emphasis on sets and costumes. The clergy would wear their religious garb, and there would not be any depiction of an actual location. So usually the plays would be performed in the church courtyard. It would be performed outside, and the people would come and watch it, and you would just kind of imagine the location. But this worked well for these plays because they weren't really realism like we think of them now. They were allegories for the most part. An example of this would be probably the most famous play to survive from this, a play called Everyman. Everyman, written by probably the most famous of authors, Anonymous. Um, so Everyman is exactly as it sounds. The main character is someone called Everyman, and Everyman goes on his journey and encounters characters who have names like Good Deeds. And so the character of Good Deeds will show Everyman all the good deeds that he did in his life. So you can see it's a very symbolic type of show, which lends itself to having no sets and no costumes. And so it's basically like kind of a morality play. So these were very popular at the time because uh, not only were people not being frowned on for going to theater since it was being performed by the church, but they were also learning about their religion. It's an aspect of theater that will, again, not be a term at this time, but later on, people will say there's a goal of theater is one of two things, or both, to entertain and or educate. That's the purpose of theater. So you have to do one or the other, but preferably both. So for instance, you can say Terence and Plautus in ancient Rome were there to entertain. And now mystery and miracle plays are there simply to educate. They can be entertaining, but at the time, the church wasn't as concerned about how entertaining they were as long as they were educational. And educational in the sense that you're learning about Christianity from the performances. So eventually we get to the mid 1500s and we get to a very, very big movement of theater, something called Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte, the mid 1500s. And this was basically a style of improv theater in Italy. So this was a very popular form of theater among the poor classes of Europe, poor classes of Italy, and eventually all of Europe. It was a very broad physical humor. Somebody I guess you could relate a comedy actor to would be someone like Jim Carrey today. It's a very broad physical humor. You can see the image on the right there is how a commedia character would stand on stage. There's a very specific type of standing. It's very rare that you were ever standing still. And it was a very popular form of theater, mainly because since it was improv theater, you didn't necessarily need a big theater building in order to do it. So they were performed by traveling troupes. And a troupe would show up on a street corner, set up shop, and then they would perform the shows. And the way that the shows would happen is a crowd would gather around and they would ask them for what was called a lazo, which is another term basically for a bit. So they would ask, give us some characters, give us a situation, and let's go. If you ever saw that old ABC show, Whose Line Is It Anyway, with Drew Carey, it's very much like that. Ask your audience for a couple character types and a situation, and then the actors create the scene there on the spot. But the thing that made this really interesting was that there were very specific types of characters, and the audience knew what they were. The audience knew the Lazos, they knew the characters, and so they would just shout out a Lazo, and the actors could just go from there. So I'll give you an example of some of the characters from Commedia. Our first character, the person who's always the main character, someone by the name of Arlecchino. Arlecchino is a servant. He is usually, or not usually, all the time, is the smartest person in the room. He's very witty, he's very smart. But his downfall is that he's very poor, so he's always susceptible to money. And because he's poor, he's always hungry, so he's very susceptible to food. So anytime someone offers him food or money, he's willing to be, taken off of the tracks that he's on. So Arlecchino is always our main character, and he always has a female love interest named Columbina. Columbina is the same as Arlecchino. She's a servant. She's always the smartest person in the room, but also susceptible to money and food. So those are usually our main characters. And there's a couple of antagonistic characters. So the first one is someone by the name of Il Capitano. Il Capitano is a soldier, and will enter the stage and will have all of his medals and regalia on, and he'll always be bragging about all of these battles that he single-handedly won, talking about how brave he is. But by the end of the scene, he's going to prove to be a complete coward. Somebody will challenge him to a fight, and then he'll run and hide behind the smallest person in the room, because really, he's a coward. Our next antagonist is someone by the name of Il Dottore. Il Dottore is an academic, or another way to say it is a professor. And so he will come out wearing his academic robes, and he's always talking down to everybody, acting like he knows everything and nobody else knows anything. But by the end of the scene, it's Il Dottore is going to be proved to be an idiot. He doesn't know anything about what he's talking about, and so he's really just making things up, and he's a very unintelligent person. And then the most famous of Commedia antagonists is someone by the name of Pantalone. Pantalone is a rich man. He's usually the richest man in town. He's the one everybody has to borrow money from, and he's also usually the father of the female love interest. There's always a young male and female lover trying to fall in love, and Arlecchino is the one trying to help them come together. So usually Pantalone is the father of the young female lover, and he's very protective of her, never wants anyone near her, and so he's the one trying to force the male and female lover apart. And usually Arlecchino is Pantalone's servant, and so he's trying to outwit or outsmart his master out of money and food. So you get a sense of who these characters are, and you can begin to see why it was such a popular form of entertainment among the poor classes of Europe. Because think about what Il Capitano, Il Dottore, and Pantalone all have in common. They are all rich aristocratic characters. And who is always the smartest person in the room? The poor servant who works for them. So these bits were basically mocking the rich aristocracy and putting the poor class up on a pedestal. And so they were very popular among the poor classes, And as you probably guessed, the rich aristocracy hated commedia, at least at the beginning. They were not very fond of commedia. Eventually, it's looked at as an art form, and so they changed their mind. But at first, they really did not like it. Uh, Now, the most important element of a commedia costume is the mask. And you get an example here of what some commedia masks look like. Every commedia character wears a mask, all except the young male and female lover. They are the only two who don't wear masks. Everyone else does. And the purpose of the mask was to tell the audience what character you were. Every character has certain characteristics that will be on their mask. For instance, Pantalone will always have a very large, phallic like nose, which is kind of mocking him, making fun of him. And so everybody would wear a mask, and then every actor would kind of customize their mask so that they could be recognizable. Because again, if you're wearing a mask the whole time, the audience won't really see your face, won't recognize you. So you needed to personalize your mask so that people would remember who you were. And this was because some commedia actors would get a following at the time. A troupe would show up in town, and people would say, "Oh, you have to go see this troupe. The person they have who plays Pantalone is, I've heard, is the best Pantalone you'll ever see." And a commedia actor at the time would play the same character throughout their entire life. Whether you were young or old, you would be Il Capitano, you would be Pantalone, you'd be Arlecchino, whoever. Because you were wearing a mask, your actual age really didn't factor into it. And so you would be playing the same character throughout your life. So you would begin to have a following behind you if you were somebody who's very good, or somebody of note. So one way to relate this to anything today would be modern day cartoons. Modern day cartoons are what we have that probably closest is the closest resemblance to commedia. For example, take Looney Tunes. With Looney Tunes, who's your main character? The main character is always Bugs Bunny. And then Bugs Bunny is always surrounded by these very specific types of antagonists. You have Elmer Fudd, who's a caricature of a hunter. You have Yosemite Sam, who's the caricature of a Wild West cowboy. And so you would watch Bugs Bunny outsmart these characters. Now, you never watched it wondering if Bugs Bunny was going to lose this time. You always knew he was going to outsmart Elmer Fudd or Yosemite Sam. The reason why you're watching is to see how he's going to outsmart them this time. You know that the coyote is never going to catch the roadrunner. The reason why you watch it is to see how he's going to fail this time. And this is how people were watching commedia at the time. When you were watching a commedia scene, you knew Arlecchino was going to outsmart Pantalone. The reason why you were watching was to see how he was going to outsmart him this time. And because it was improv, you were watching to see how the actor was going to make it up on the spot as well. So Looney Tunes kind of resembles that, and cartoons in general very much resemble what commedia was. Eventually, we do get some scripted commedia plays. The most notable is a play called The Servant of Two Masters. The basic premise of the play is that Arlecchino is serving Pantalone, and he realizes that he's getting a certain amount of money for being Pantalone's servant, but if he gets a second master, then he'll get twice as much money. And so he takes on a second master, and then, of course, chaos ensues. So we do have some scripted commedia plays out there, but for the most part, it was a style of improv comedy, and it's a style that's still alive today. You can still see commedia shows; they're very entertaining. In fact, you can find a lot of them up on YouTube, since a lot of them are short bits. People will have comedic skits that they post on YouTube. So it's something to check out if you have a chance, because it can be very entertaining if done well, like most improv comedy. So this brings us to our next movement of theater, something that we call Elizabethan theater. This begins around the mid 1500s and ends abruptly in the year 1642. So with Elizabethan theater, we're talking about theater in England, and it's called Elizabethan theater because it's during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth was a big fan of theater, and so because of that, the theaters kind of flourished under her at the time. Some notable playwrights of the time were William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson. Now, the what was interesting about this time was that we talked about this a little bit in our section on producing, but there was a change in how people were watching theater. There was now a convergence of all the classes onto one set theater building to watch theater. Um, we didn't have a separation of the poor and the wealthy. The poor and the wealthy each had a different level of comfort in the theater, but they were essentially watching the same show. So because of that, the theater or the writers became even more popular. These writers were looked at the time, kind of like how we look at pop stars today. They'll have a very passionate following behind them. For instance, to give an example of how passionate fans of these writers were, the playwright Ben Jonson, when he died penniless. He didn't have any money. Now, in England, or in London specifically, there is there's a cemetery where the most notable writers get to be buried. And so when he died, his fans, to honor his work, wanted him to be buried in the cemetery. However, since he died penniless, his estate didn't have any money to get him a burial plot. So his fans actually raised money so that he could be buried there. However, they couldn't raise enough money to buy a full burial plot. And so what they did was they bought a square plot and they buried him standing up. They buried him standing up vertically in a square plot so that in the end he could be in the cemetery and his work could be honored in that way. So you get a sense of how passionate um, these fans were of writers at the time. In fact, one of the reasons why Shakespeare is probably still remembered today, other than being as gifted of a writer as he is, was mainly because Queen Elizabeth was a big fan of his work, and so that really did help propel him in his career at the time. So when the Queen is one of your fans, you're going to end up doing very well. So what we have here is an example of what one of what the theaters at the time looked like. So it was a circular building like you see there, and it was open to the night sky. So if you were one of if you were of the poor class, you would be standing in front of the stage there in that open area. And if you were wealthy, then you were able to afford a seat on one of the sides that were covered. And one interesting aspect of this, every theater at the time had what was called the Queen's box. There was a box directly across from the stage that was reserved specifically for the Queen. And if the Queen was not in attendance at your theater, the box stayed empty. Nobody sat there. And so it was a kind of way to promote your show, because if the Queen attended your show, you were going to sell out the rest of your performances. And so you wanted the Queen to be able to be easily seen by the rest of the audience when she was there, so that when they leave, they can go tell everyone they know that the Queen attended that show, and then all the performances after that, it'll be sold out. Now, it was a very difficult time to watch theater. So you'll notice that one, it's open to the night sky. So if there's any type of weather, you would be standing through it unless you decided to leave. So you weren't protected from the elements. And shows at this time were much longer than we're used to now. If you've ever watched one of Shakespeare's plays unabridged, they're very long. There's sometimes will be 3.5 or almost 4 hours long. So if you were watching one of those shows, you were standing in that orchestra pit there for about 4 hours. And so you would bring food with you to the theater. You would stop at one of at the market outside the theater, and you would buy some fruits and vegetables and bring them into the theater with you, and you'd snack on them throughout the show. Now, the audiences of this time were very interactive when it came to the performances. They were very vocal throughout the show. If they liked the show, they let the actors know it. They cheered as they would come out. They would cheer the protagonist. And if they didn't like the show, they also let you know. They also let you know. They would boo the actors as they came out. They would throw things at them. If you've ever seen that classic depiction of a stand-up comedian bombing on stage and people are throwing tomatoes and stuff at them, this comes from Elizabethan theater. Because, like I said, you're going to be in the theater for about 4 hours. You bring food in with you, which are fruits and vegetables. Well, if you didn't like the show, if a lot of people in the crowd didn't like the show, they would start throwing their food at the actors on the stage before they left, as they booed them. So it was a very interesting time to watch theater. It also wasn't very hygienic. So remember, this was a time before indoor plumbing. And so if you were standing in that orchestra pit and you had to go to the bathroom, then you pretty much just went where you were standing. So it was very unhygienic. In fact, the theaters did close for a short period of time uh, when the plague broke out. They were afraid that the plague was spreading through the theaters, and so they closed them down for a short period of time because of that. Now, some interesting aspects of performance elements at this time. There was no emphasis on sets and costumes. There would be no sets or anything on stage to depict a set, and there were no costumes. The actors would wear their regular clothes of the day. This is why, if you ever read plays of this time, especially Shakespeare's plays, you'll notice that there'll be a time where the characters come out and they'll have a line that goes something like, "Oh, look, it's great to be out here in the forest." And the reason why they have this line is to let the audience know we are now in the forest, because that location is not being depicted on stage. So the audience hears the line, they go, "Okay, in the forest, got it, moving on." Or, someone comes out and says, "I am Julius Caesar," and the audience says, "Okay," imagining that he has a toga on, moving on. So it was all done through the dialogue itself. There wasn't any anything put on stage to represent that. You would have some props with you, but there wasn't a set and there were no costumes. And another very interesting aspect of this time was that women weren't allowed on stage. And so all of the female roles would have been played by young boys. The way it would work is that you would begin your acting career when you're very young. You would play female parts until you aged into the male parts, and then you would play all the male roles going forward. So the original Juliet was probably a 12, 13-year-old boy who was dressed up as a girl out on stage. So you can also get a sense as to why at this time the church really did not like the theater, especially at this time because there's a large Puritan population in London, and the Puritans absolutely hated the theater. They were, a very uh, conservative group of people. They didn't like the fact that boys were dressing up as girls on stage. They didn't like the subject matter, which dealt a lot with young boy men and women falling in love and kissing on stage and stuff like that. They didn't like it. Now the theaters themselves were such a popular business at the time that there was an actual person in the city government whose sole job was to oversee the theaters. It's called the Master at Arms. And so the Puritans are always petitioning the Master at Arms to close the theaters down. So you see here a map of London around this time, and uh, there's kind of a wall that you'll see there, and inside that wall is what you consider, London proper, and the theaters were on that side of London, inside the wall there. Now, eventually, the Puritans come to a compromise with the Master at Arms. The Master at Arms says that all the theaters have to move south of the Thames. They have to move south of the river. And so you'll see in this picture, there's a red dot depicting where all of the theaters are. So eventually, all of the theaters leave London proper and move across the Thames there. Now, eventually, the Puritans do keep pressing the Master at Arms to close the theaters, and eventually, in 1642, they get their wish, and all of the theaters in London are finally closed. Now, there's kind of a lull in theater for a very short period of time, especially in England, but eventually the theaters opened back up to a very new style of theater, something we call Restoration theater. So in 1660, the Puritans are booted out of England, booted out of London, and the theaters open back up. And now that they've been closed for a short period of time and they open back up, we find a new form of theater. And this new form of theater is very much a reaction against the previous Puritan rule. It's kind of a highly sexualized style of show. They were pretty much comedies, and they dealt a lot with the rich ruling class. The characters are always, the rich aristocracy, and the plots themselves were kind of frivolous in a way. The It always dealt with somebody trying to win the hand of somebody else or win their love, and for some reason or another, somebody else is trying to break them apart. In these stories, the worst thing that somebody could do to you was talk about you behind your back. But the style of theater itself changed a lot. Um, we get the first time now that women are allowed on stage. So now women are performing the female roles out on stage, and unlike Elizabethan theater, women are allowed to write and be published. Before, in Elizabethan England, in Elizabethan theater, women could not be published. Their plays couldn't be performed. Women weren't allowed to write, basically. And in Restoration theater, we finally get our first instance where women are allowed to write and be published. And so that brings us to a very important name in theater history, and that is Aphra Behn, who goes down as the first female playwright. She is the first woman in the Restoration period here who has a play performed under her name and published under her name. So she gets the title of first female playwright, and of course, she's not the first woman ever to write a play. Women were writing for a very long time, but unfortunately, they couldn't be published under their own name. A lot of times, there were many instances of, women would write a play and they would have to have it credited to a man in order to have it be performed. In fact, that's where some of the controversy over Shakespeare's work comes. There's a long-standing conspiracy theory, a ridiculous conspiracy theory, that Shakespeare isn't the one who wrote his plays. And one of the people that are credited as being the real author of his plays is Queen Elizabeth herself, or a few other women of the time. People saying that a woman had paid him to take credit for it since they couldn't be published under their own name. It is a ridiculous conspiracy theory, but if you're ever looking to fall down a Wikipedia or Google hole for a couple hours, you can have at it. But Aphra goes down as the first female playwright at this time. Now, like I mentioned too, is a very sexualized style of show. Since the Puritans are a very repressive kind of people, the Restoration theater tries to play against that idea. So you can see what some of the production values at the time look like. Now, unlike Elizabethan theater, there is a big emphasis on sets and costumes. There were very large, elaborate sets. There were very colorful, elaborate costumes. And you can see from the costumes there, they accentuate the sexuality of the human body. It was in this time that we have the incorporation of probably one of the most evil pieces of clothing ever created, which is the corset. You can see the two female actors in that picture there are both wearing a corset. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a very painful piece of clothing that a woman is put in. You need a second person to put you into it, somebody behind you to tie you into the garment. And it basically shrinks the hips and pushes the breasts up, kind of the sexual or accenting the sexual nature of the female body. And then on the right here, you'll see an example of a male costume in Restoration Theater, which is also a sexualized form of the male body. And you might be wondering, in what way is it, sexualizing the male body? And that is, if you look at the actor's legs. The actor's legs are visible, and most notably, the actor's calves. At this time, what was considered to be the most, beautiful part or sexual part of a man's body was his calf. And so you can see how the actor is standing in this picture. And the reason for that is if you were a man of a well-endowed calf, you would walk out on stage and you would display it for everyone to see, like the actor is doing in this picture on the right. So it's kind of silly to think about today, but I pointed out to let you know that this was a very sexualized style of theater at the time, but in their standards at that time, not necessarily in our standards today. But again, remember, this was all because they were revolting against that previous Puritan rule that has now been ousted out of England. So the next form of theater we're going to look at is something called melodrama. Melodrama, something that starts up in the mid-18th century. And melodrama derives directly from the Restoration theater. Most Restoration shows were things we called Restoration comedy. They were meant to be lighthearted things they could be taken as seriously, but it was mainly supposed to, entertain and make people laugh and feel good. And melodrama took the style of theater and applied it to stories of more serious subject matter. Now, melodrama is the style of theater that's happening directly before we get to modern drama. We get to Stanislavski and his method. So remember, Stanislavski was revolting against melodrama. And so melodrama is kind of the antithesis of everything we learned about Stanislavski and the method. It's a very heightened sense of reality, a very exaggerated type of acting. This is that style of theater where if someone is angry, they're shaking their fist at the sky, or if someone is in love, they hold their heart and look at the sky as they sigh. You know, those kind of exaggerated ways of displaying emotion. Remember, with melodrama, people or actors are playing emotions on stage. This is why Stanislavski came around and said you can't play an emotion on stage, you play an action, because in melodrama people are playing emotions. But it was a very popular form of entertainment. You can see in the picture on the right there an image of what a melodrama theater or what a theater looked like at the time that would have been playing melodrama. This is a period of time when we have these large state houses that could hold hundreds and hundreds of people. Um, and the production value was very elaborate. Very large sets, very elaborate costumes. The stage itself was very big. You would have people riding actual horses on stage, things like that. Um, but again, it was a very kind of, I don't know, almost cheesy way of playing people on stage. The thing that we have today that closely resembles melodrama are modern day soap operas. All those soap operas that you'll find during daytime television, those are melodramas. Those are what melodramas were like. The style of acting, that very serious, over the top way of presenting somebody is melodrama, and even the style of storytelling where you have those very large plot twists. Somebody comes back after being thought dead for 30 years, and now they're back, only to find that their love of their life has remarried somebody else, and everyone gasps in shock. This is the type of storytelling that you would find with melodrama, and it basically uh, uh, went into what is now modern day soap operas. So this is what is directly predates modern drama and Stanislavski and everything that we've been talking about this semester. However, there's one more style of theater to talk about, something that starts up after Stanislavski's method, and that's avant-garde theater. Avant-garde theater, or what's also known as absurdist theater or experimental theater. And this starts in the mid 1950s. And this style of theater is a revolt against Stanislavski and his method. So, in order to do that, they are not trying to portray reality. This is a revolt against realism, a revolt against naturalism. It goes in the exact opposite direction. We are not trying to portray reality. Instead, you're trying to outwardly portray the theme of a show. So, whatever that underlying meaning to the show is, you're actually putting that out on the surface. You're not trying to subtly hint towards it. Um, Two most notable plays of this time were plays called Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett and The Hairy Ape by Eugene O'Neill. So, an example of how you outwardly portray the theme of the show would be the play The Hairy Ape. The story itself is very straightforward, when you describe it, but it's in the performance of it that the absurdism comes in. So, in The Hairy Ape, the guy on the right there in the picture, our main character, he's somebody who works in a mine shaft. Him and his friends, they all work in the mine. They're all these poor working class people. And eventually, one day, he's introduced to, or he sees the mine owner's daughter, who's in the left side of that picture. He sees her, and he immediately falls in love. And he decides what he's going to do is he's going to leave the mines and pretend to be a rich man in order to win her heart. So it seems like a pretty straightforward story. But when you perform this show, the way you perform it is that our main character and all the other people who are the poor working class people, they all move like apes. They all move exactly like apes, not subtly like it. They literally move around like apes on stage. And The mine owner's daughter and everyone else who are in the rich aristocratic class, they all move like robots, very stiff looking, mechanicalized style of movement. And so what they're doing is they're taking that underlying theme of the raw animalistic nature, the poor working man, and the cold detachment, emotionlessness of the rich aristocracy. They're taking that underlying meaning and they're outwardly putting it out onto the stage for you to see it. It's not subtle and it's not trying to depict people as they look in real life, but instead how they are under the surface. That would be avant-garde theater. Um, and same goes for Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot is basically a play about two people waiting for someone to come who never shows up. And in the play, we have those our two characters who you see there, who are kind of these two vagabonds, as they're described in the play, basically two homeless guys, and they're waiting for a man named Godot to show up and give them a job. And he's going to make everything better for them. So they're waiting for him to show up, but in the end, he doesn't show up, and all they can do is sit and wait for him. And the play is supposed to be a metaphor for waiting for God, saying that we're all waiting for God to come and make our lives better, but He's never going to show up and magically make things better. We need to fix things for ourselves. And the reason why it's one of the most notable plays of the avant-garde theater movement is because it's basically embodying the ideas that started the movement. And it kind of makes sense if you think about the time period in the mid 1950s. We were in a world where World War II just ended. Humanity is trying to come to terms with the atrocities that were committed and all the lives that were lost. And there's a basic idea in a lot of theater artists that these ideas of psychology and sociology, that people are these psychological case studies that can be figured out. None of that is true. People are chaos. They can't be figured out. There's no rhyme or reason to life. Things don't happen for a reason, things just happen. And so they wanted to create a movement of theater that depicted those ideas. So in avant garde theater, you don't display reality. You don't have this idea of cause and effect to storytelling. Things just happen for no reason because of the chaotic nature of life and of human beings. And so that's kind of the basis of what the movement or the style of theater is. And so that pretty much brings us to today. There are some other smaller movements that have started up since then, but that's some of the probably the biggest ones to date. So these are the styles of theater that are basically coming in between ancient Greece and modern drama, and then one of them that comes after it.